The storm had come without warning. It roared across the open field like a beast unleashed, dark clouds twisting together, threatening to swallow the sky. The rain poured in sheets, heavy and unforgiving, washing away everything in its path. In the midst of this chaos, a small, trembling figure darted through the tall grass, a puppy, no more than 6 months old, its fur soaked, its heart racing. His name was Max, a bundle of fur too young to understand the weight of the world around him. He wasn't supposed to be here. Not in this storm. Not alone. Max's paws slipped on the wet ground as he scrambled, ears flat against his skull, his breath shallow. He could hear the cries, soft, high-pitched, desperate, coming from somewhere ahead. The sound cut through the thrum of rain like a plea for help. Max froze. His instincts, those primitive, primal urges, kicked in. There was something more important than finding shelter. It was the voices, the cries of the baby ducks caught in the rising floodwater, their tiny wings flapping helplessly, their calls mingling with the wind. Max didn't think. He ran. His chest ached with the effort, his muscles burning as he pushed through the storm. He had no idea how to save them, no idea if he could even reach them in time, but he knew one thing: they needed him. Max had been abandoned as a puppy, left in the harsh streets to fend for himself. He didn't have a family, not the kind that others could rely on. He'd learned early to survive on scraps, to trust no one but himself. But there was always something inside him, a soft pulse of kindness that he couldn't shake off. It was that same warmth that led him to the small family farm, where a kindly woman had taken him in after finding him one cold evening in the pouring rain. The first few days at the farm were peaceful, filled with the scent of fresh hay and the sound of soft wind rustling through the trees. Max had never known anything like it, but now, as the storm surged around him, the quiet farm felt like a distant memory, a fleeting dream. Max had wandered too far from the safety of the barn that afternoon, chasing an illusory scent, and now the world was closing in on him. The storm was relentless, its fury blurring everything in sight. His heart pounded against his ribcage as the cries of the ducklings grew louder. They were somewhere ahead, trapped in the rising floodwater. Max's thoughts blurred into a single, overwhelming instinct: find them. He skidded to a halt, his paws sinking into the mud, his chest heaving. His senses sharpened. Through the sheets of rain he saw them. The tiny ducklings were huddled together, surrounded by water that was rising fast. They were helpless, unable to escape the flood. Max didn't hesitate. He bounded forward, his fur drenched and heavy with the weight of the storm. But as he leaped toward them, a wave of water crashed down on the group, sweeping them farther away. Max's heart dropped. There was no time. He couldn't lose them. Not like this. Not after everything he had been through. Max fought against the water with all his strength, the current pulling at his legs. The storm was unforgiving, each gust of wind battering him harder, pushing him farther from the ducklings. The once quiet, peaceful farm felt like another world. Max had no time to think about the life he had left behind, the life he was still building with the kind woman who had given him a chance. Right now, he was all they had. If he failed, they wouldn't survive. The fear he felt in that moment wasn't for himself. It was for them, the tiny, fragile creatures who had no idea what was coming for them. They were trusting him, a misunderstood puppy who had been abandoned just like them. The weight of that trust, the gravity of his responsibility, anchored him to the spot. Max's paws were slipping, and his muscles were exhausted. His mind screamed at him to stop, to seek shelter and warmth, but he couldn't. Not yet. He could feel their presence, the little ducklings, fighting against the water, their feathers heavy with rain. They were too small, too fragile. A sudden wave crashed over him, knocking him sideways. He gasped for breath as water filled his mouth, and for a moment he thought he might drown. But then he saw them, 2 of the ducklings, struggling to stay above the rising water. Their little bodies were trembling, and Max knew they wouldn't last much longer. With everything he had left, he surged forward. Pushing through the water, his body burning with exhaustion, he reached them. He grabbed one by the scruff of its tiny neck, his teeth gentle but firm. The duckling squirmed, its beak opening and closing in silent distress, but Max didn't let go. The other followed, its little wings beating helplessly against the wind. He dragged them to the bank, struggling against the water. He didn't know how he was still moving, but he did. He didn't stop. The storm didn't stop, and neither would he. Max could hear the wind howling around him, but his focus was on the ducklings. They were trembling, their tiny bodies shivering in the cold. He could feel the sharp sting of the wind against his fur, but the warmth of their tiny forms pressed against him kept him going. It wasn't much, just the soft weight of them, but it was enough. It reminded him of the warmth he had found in the barn, the place where he had been given a chance. It reminded him of the family he had found, the one that had taken him in and loved him when no one else had. The storm was still raging, but Max felt a quiet shift within himself. The fear, the doubt, the exhaustion, they were all still there. But now they were tempered by something else, a quiet certainty that he could do this. He was doing this. He watched the little ducklings, their eyes wide and trusting. Max could feel their tiny hearts beating in sync with his own. They were scared, but they had survived. They had fought to stay alive, and so had he. They were both resilient, both survivors. In the distance, Max saw the barn lights flickering, the silhouette of the woman running toward him. She had been watching from the safety of the barn, waiting for him to return. Her voice echoed across the field, calling his name, but Max didn't need to hear it. He already knew that she was there. He was never alone anymore. The world was big, but the love he had found in this place was bigger. The storm was beginning to die down. The rain had slowed to a gentle drizzle, and the wind had softened into a breeze. The world around Max was still dark and damp, but there was a new sense of peace settling over the land. The ducklings had calmed, their tiny bodies pressed against his, their soft breaths mingling with his own. The woman reached him, kneeling down in the wet grass, her arms wide to gather him into her embrace. Max let out a soft, relieved whine and she scooped him up, cradling him like the small, trembling creature he was. The ducklings, safe and dry, flapped their wings in an awkward, wet dance as she gently placed them in the shelter of the barn. Max felt his muscles relax, his heart slowing its frantic beat. The storm had passed. The fear, the chaos, it was all over. And though he was still exhausted, there was a deep satisfaction inside him. He had done it. He had saved them. The woman stroked his soaked fur, whispering soft praises into his ears. Max leaned into her touch, his eyes closing for a moment as he rested in her arms. He had been misunderstood, alone, but now he was home. Days passed, and the farm returned to its peaceful rhythm. The storm had come and gone, but it had left behind something more lasting than just wet grass and broken branches. It had left a bond between Max and the ducklings, a bond that had formed in the darkest moments of fear and uncertainty. Max had found his place. He wasn't just the abandoned puppy anymore. He was a protector, a friend, a hero in the eyes of the tiny creatures who had once been so vulnerable. He had grown, no longer the scared, unsure pup that had run from the chaos of the world, but a creature who faced it head-on with courage and love. The farm was calm again. The sun was setting on the horizon, casting a golden glow over the fields. Max stood at the edge of the barn, watching the sky change color, feeling the warmth of the evening breeze against his fur. He had rescued them, but in the process, he had rescued himself. The storm had shown him who he truly was, not just a survivor, but a protector, a friend. And as the ducklings waddled up to him, chirping happily, Max felt the soft flutter of their tiny wings against his side. He wasn't alone anymore. And for the first time in his life, he was exactly where he was meant to be. The days were brighter now. The sun had returned, casting its warm, golden rays across the land, and with it, a new sense of harmony seemed to take root. Max had become an integral part of the farm's daily rhythm, the bond between him and the ducklings growing deeper by the day. Their trust in him was unwavering, and Max, once a solitary soul, now found comfort in their company. His bond with the ducks was a delicate dance, gentle like the touch of the breeze in the early morning. Each morning, they waddled behind him, their tiny feet making soft pattering sounds against the earth. Max would lead them to the small pond near the barn, the water shimmering in the light of the rising sun. He would sit by the edge watching them swim, his tail wagging slowly, the rhythm of his joy quiet but steady. The once chaotic storm that had torn through the farm had given way to something more profound. An unspoken understanding between them, an almost sacred connection. Max's heart was lighter. The small, trembling pup who had once been on the fringes of the world, struggling to survive, had transformed into a protector, a figure of resilience. He wasn't just part of the farm, he was a vital presence, a heartbeat that kept the pulse of life steady in the midst of everything else. One morning, as the sun bathed the fields in its first light, the woman came to the pond, holding a small basket of breadcrumbs for the ducks. Max, sensing her presence before she even spoke, turned to face her. His eyes met hers, and in that moment, they shared a silent understanding. The storm had not only changed the world outside, but it had changed them too. The woman knelt down, placing the basket gently on the ground. Her hands were warm and calloused from the work of the farm, but they were tender as they reached for Max. She stroked his head, her touch a quiet reassurance. Max pressed his head against her hand, the comfort of her presence reminding him of the safety he had found here. This was home. Not just the barn or the farm, but the people who had given him a second chance, who had allowed him to be who he was meant to be, unafraid and full of purpose. As the ducks ate the crumbs at the water's edge, Max lay down beside the woman. The warmth of the sun on his back felt like a quiet promise. There would be no more storms to face, not like the one that had torn through them all. It had left behind a lesson, one that they all had learned in their own ways. Survival wasn't about being alone. It was about standing together, about finding strength not in solitude, but in connection. The seasons shifted. Winter's chill would soon be creeping in, but the farm was ready. The barn was fortified against the cold, the animals fed and sheltered. Yet, for Max, the passage of time didn't feel so defined by the changing weather or the coming of the holidays. His days were simple morning walks with the woman, afternoons spent with the ducks, and long evenings by the fire, curled up in the warmth of the barn. But one evening, as Max lay beside the hearth, watching the flickering flames, he heard something that made his heart stop. The wind had picked up, rattling the windows and causing the trees to groan in the distance. And then, there it was again, the faint sound of crying. The sound was distant but unmistakable. Max's ears perked up, his body tense. It was a soft cry, but one filled with distress. His eyes darted to the door, and for a moment, the peaceful world of the farm seemed to shift. The call of the wild that had been so quiet for so long was returning, calling him back. Max stood up, his legs stiff with a sudden urgency. His heart raced, but this time, it wasn't fear. It was the call to action, the same primal instinct that had led him to the ducklings in the storm. The woman was still inside, oblivious to the distant cries. But Max knew what he had to do. Without hesitation, he pushed open the barn door and bolted into the night. The wind whipped against his face, the rain starting to fall again. But this time, he didn't care. He was running toward something. A sound that had been long buried, an instinct that had been honed by survival. The world around him was dark, filled with shadows, but Max's path was clear. He followed the cries, his feet pounding against the wet earth, the scent of the air sharp in his nostrils. The sound led him to the edge of the farm, where the trees stood tall and looming, their branches swaying in the storm's embrace. There, in the darkness, was a small, abandoned puppy. The sight stopped Max in his tracks. The pup, no more than a few weeks old, lay shivering in the underbrush, its eyes wide with fear. Its tiny body was cold, its fur matted from the rain. Max felt a surge of protectiveness. The memory of his own abandonment, the fear of being alone, flooded back. He couldn't leave this one behind. Without thinking, Max nudged the pup with his nose, urging it to stand. The little creature whimpered, but it managed to stagger to its feet. Max moved closer, his body protective, his movements gentle. The storm raged around them, but Max remained calm, guiding the pup back toward the warmth of the barn. When they arrived, the woman was there, her face a mixture of surprise and concern. She knelt down, her hands moving quickly to shelter the new pup, her gaze meeting Max's with silent gratitude. The storm outside was nothing compared to the storm of emotions that ran through them all in that moment. Max had done it again. He had saved another life. The woman smiled softly as she cradled the new pup, warmth returning to its trembling body. Max, exhausted but triumphant, lay down beside her. His heart swelled with pride. He wasn't just a puppy anymore. He was a protector, a guardian of those who needed him. And as the fire crackled in the hearth, the warmth of the barn wrapping around them, Max understood. His journey was not just about survival. It was about finding his purpose, one life at a time. And he had found it, standing right here, beside the woman who had given him a second chance, and the creatures who had shown him what it truly meant to belong. The storm outside had passed, but within the barn, Max had found a quiet, unspoken promise, a promise to never let anyone be left behind again. The days passed like a soft rhythm, unhurried, grounded, and full of quiet moments. Max had become something more than the little puppy that had once been lost in the storm. He was now the steady presence of the farm, a guardian not just for the animals but for the woman who had given him a home. The barn, the trees, the fields, everything felt like a sanctuary, and Max, in his humble way, had become its protector. He was always alert, his eyes scanning the horizon, his ears attuned to every sound. There was peace in his vigilance. But as the seasons deepened into the cold of winter, Max's world shifted once again. The pup he had rescued, now named Charlie, had quickly grown into a festy little creature, full of energy and curiosity. His bright, eager eyes often sought Max out for guidance. Max, though more reserved, couldn't help but feel a surge of affection whenever Charlie came bounding up to him, paws eager for a playmate. In Charlie, Max saw the same wildness, the same untamed spirit that had once burned in him. One evening, as the sky painted itself in the deep hues of twilight, Max and Charlie wandered the fields together. The air was crisp, the ground hard underfoot, but there was a stillness to the world, as if the earth itself were holding its breath. The wind had died down, leaving only the sound of their footsteps and the occasional rustle of leaves in the trees. Max, as always, kept a watchful eye on his younger companion, the protective instinct never far from the surface. But then there was a sound, a faint rustle. It was too soft to be anything serious, too gentle to be alarming. Yet something in Max's bones told him to pause. His head tilted, ears pricked. He could smell it before he could see it. The scent of smoke, faint but unmistakable. Charlie stopped, his small body tensing beside Max. His eyes darted to the horizon where the last traces of the sun had disappeared, leaving a blanket of darkness across the land. The air felt thick, heavy with the scent of something burning. Max's pulse quickened. The wind was beginning to pick up again, but this time it carried something else with it, the promise of danger. Max's instinct surged. He nudged Charlie gently, and together, they began to move toward the edge of the field, the direction from which the smoke was coming. The once serene landscape now felt menacing, as if the earth itself was warning them. They arrived at the tree line where the smoke grew denser, the scent stronger. And then they saw it, a fire, small at first, but quickly growing larger. It had started in the distance, creeping along the dry brush, and was now inching closer to the farm. Max's heart pounded. This wasn't just a danger to the wildlife or the barn. It was a threat to everything he had fought to protect. Without hesitation, Max darted forward, his mind focused entirely on the fire. The urgency flooded him, and without a second thought, he ran toward the farmhouse. He needed to warn the woman. He needed to protect the ones he loved. Charlie hesitated, unsure of what was happening. But Max was already gone, his legs pumping against the cold ground. The farm was still a long way off, the fire was too far from the barn to be fully seen. But the smoke was everywhere now, thick and heavy. Max's paws thundered against the earth, his body driven by the raw urgency of the moment. The farmhouse came into view just as Max's muscles began to burn, his breath coming in sharp gasps. The smoke clouded the air, stinging his eyes, and the wind had picked up again, pushing the fire closer. Max's heart raced with the pounding of his feet. The woman had to know. The animals had to be moved. They had to get to safety. He burst through the door, his chest heaving, his fur slick with sweat and ash. The woman was standing by the stove, humming softly to herself, unaware of the danger creeping ever closer. Max's bark shattered the stillness of the room. He leapt toward her, pawing at her legs, his eyes wide and panicked. Max. The woman's voice was laced with confusion. But there was no time for words. Max's instinct screamed. He turned, his gaze fixed on the open door, urging her to follow. The urgency in his eyes was unmistakable. It took her a moment, but she understood. Her expression shifted from confusion to realization, and within seconds she was moving toward the door. Max followed her out, and together they stood at the edge of the field, where the fire could now be seen clearly, its orange glow creeping through the trees. The woman's eyes widened in shock. "We need to move quickly," she said, her voice steady but full of determination. She reached for the radio on the farmhouse porch and called for help, but the wind was already picking up again, the flames licking at the edges of the trees. There was no time to wait. Max's role was clear. He bounded toward the barn, where the animals were still sheltered. The woman followed him, and together they worked quickly, moving the animals out to a safer part of the property. Charlie, now by Max's side, looked at him for guidance, his young eyes full of concern. Max barked at him, his voice commanding. Charlie hesitated but followed Max's lead, herding the smaller animals with a growing sense of responsibility. In the distance, sirens wailed, and the woman's calls for help echoed across the land, but the fire was growing too fast. The smoke stung Max's eyes and his legs felt heavy, but he never stopped. The familiar scent of the barn, hay, warmth, life drove him forward. With each step, the fire's heat became more intense, but Max's resolve hardened. He wasn't going to stop, not now. Not when there was still something to protect. Max and Charlie worked side by side, guiding the animals away from the encroaching flames. The woman had already called for help, but it felt like an eternity before the fire trucks would arrive. The sky was darkening faster, the orange glow of the fire reflecting in the woman's eyes as she led the last of the animals to the safety of the farthest field. Max turned, the wind now howling around him, the flames casting long shadows across the land. The barn was on fire. The wooden structure, once a safe haven, was now a flickering inferno, the heat unbearable even from a distance. The woman stood at the edge of the field, her eyes locked on the flames, but Max knew. He could see it in her posture, in the way she held herself so still. The loss was too great to process yet. But there was no time for grief. The storm that had arrived with the fire, the chaos, the destruction, was still raging, and Max wasn't about to let it take everything from them. The woman, her face etched with determination, turned to him, her hand resting on his head. She didn't say anything, but Max could see it in her eyes, the silent promise to rebuild. The love for everything that had been lost, but the courage to move forward. And as the fire trucks arrived, Max knew that, despite the devastation, there was something even more important here: survival. The storm had come, but it was also passing. And through it all, Max had been there, steadfast, unwavering, a guardian at the center of the storm. The fire would burn itself out, but the bond between them, the animals and the land, was unbreakable. They would rebuild together, just as they had before. The days that followed the fire were filled with exhaustion, sorrow, and a kind of quiet resilience that only comes from living through a storm and knowing that there's work to be done. The barn, where so much had happened, where Max had first found safety and purpose, was gone. Its charred remnants stood as a silent reminder of the forces of nature, powerful, destructive, and indifferent. Yet, as the smoke cleared and the fire trucks left, Max felt a new wave of determination stirring inside him. This wasn't the end. The woman stood at the edge of the ruined barn, her gaze fixed on the destruction. Her face was set, her lips pressed tight, but there was a quiet strength in the way she held herself. She had lost much, but she had not lost everything. The animals were safe. Max, Charlie, and the other creatures on the farm were safe, and that, in the end, was enough to begin again. Max sat beside her, his presence steady as always. The morning light was soft and gentle, casting a warm glow over the smoldering ashes. The winds had finally calmed, and the world was still. Max looked at the woman, his eyes filled with a quiet promise. He would help her rebuild, just as he had helped her when the storm had first arrived. Together, they would create something stronger, something that could weather any future storms. Over the next few weeks, the farm slowly came back to life. The barn had to be rebuilt, but in its place, something new began to emerge. Max watched as the woman worked tirelessly, as the land began to recover, and as the animals returned to their routines. The scent of fresh wood mixed with the earthy smell of damp soil, and Max reveled in the feeling of the land coming alive again. He had become a part of it, an integral force that helped hold the farm together. Charlie, now a bit older and full of boundless energy, continued to learn from Max. His once uncertain steps had turned into confident strides. Every day they spent hours together, running through the fields, herding the ducks, and watching the sunsets. Max could feel the connection between them growing stronger with every passing moment. Charlie had become his companion, his partner in this new world, and Max was proud of the pup he had saved. The woman often caught them in the early mornings, side by side, watching the sunrise, their silhouettes framed by the golden light. And every time, she would smile to herself, knowing that this was the life she had always dreamed of, a life built on resilience, loved, and the quiet strength of those around her. Max had brought that strength back into her life, and in return, he had found the purpose he had always been searching for. The days were quieter now, the world at peace again, but Max's instincts remained sharp. He knew that calm was temporary. Life on the farm would always be unpredictable, but the storms, both the literal and emotional ones, had a way of shaping the world around them. And then, one fateful afternoon, a new storm rolled in. It didn't come with the ferocity of the first one, but it was enough to stir the air with a sense of anticipation. enough to make Max's fur prickle and his muscles tense. The wind shifted suddenly, carrying with it a chill that made the trees sway. The sky, once clear and blue, now darkened with the threat of something far more subtle, an impending change, a shift that would test their resolve once more. Max stood at the edge of the fields, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the horizon. The clouds had begun to gather, the winds picking up once more. He could feel the familiar weight of anxiety in the pit of his stomach, the same sensation that had gnawed at him during the storm months ago. It wasn't just the weather that unsettled him, it was the knowledge that a storm, in whatever form it took, would always be on the horizon. As he turned to head back to the farm, the woman appeared beside him, her eyes scanning the sky with the same unease. Max could see the worry on her face, but she didn't say a word. She didn't have to. The connection between them had grown deeper than words could express. Max's presence was a comfort, just as hers was to him. They both understood no matter what the storm brought, they would face it together. The animals, too, sensed the change. The ducks gathered closer, their heads tucked low as they sought shelter in the barn. Charlie stayed close to Max, his tail tucked slightly between his legs, his youthful exuberance subdued by the heavy air. Max remained calm, his body poised as he took in the world around him. The storm had not yet arrived, but it was coming, and when it did, they would be ready. That evening, the sky broke open and the rain began to fall in sheets. The wind howled through the trees, the sound deafening. Max felt his heart pound as the pressure in the air mounted, but he remained at the woman's side. They had already faced the worst together. The farm had already been tested, and it had survived. Max knew the truth now. The storms would always come. They would shape them, challenge them, and sometimes break them. But they would also make them stronger. The fire that had taken the barn, the storm that had nearly taken their lives, it had all been part of the journey. It had carved out a space for them to grow, to rebuild, and to learn the true meaning of strength. The woman knelt beside Max, her hand resting on his fur. The rain was falling harder now, but there was peace in the way she held him. Her love for him was unspoken, a quiet certainty in the way she guided him through the storm. And Max, his heart steady and sure, leaned into her, knowing that no matter what came next, they would face it together. The storm raged through the night, its fury overwhelming. But as the hours passed, Max felt an unfamiliar stillness settle over him. The barn was secure, the animals sheltered, and the woman was by his side. The worst had passed, but even in the quiet aftermath, there was something more that Max had found. Something deeper than survival, something that would guide him through every storm to come. In the morning, as the first light of dawn began to break over the horizon, the world felt different. The air was fresh and clean, the earth damp but healing. The storm had left its mark, but it had also made way for something new, something stronger. Max stood at the edge of the field once more, the woman beside him. The ducks, the chickens, and the other animals were beginning to emerge from their shelters, cautious but unscathed. The farm had survived, and so had they. Together, Max turned to the woman, his eyes reflecting the calm of the new day. In that moment, as the world slowly began to heal, he understood what he had always known deep within his heart. The storms would come, they would test them, but in the end, they would always rebuild, together. And so Max stood tall, his heart full, knowing that no matter the storm, he was ready to face it, with courage, love, and the quiet strength that had always been there, waiting to be discovered, neck stand on end. It wasn't just the wind or the usual sounds of the night. These were growls, deep and guttural, almost like an animal that was not quite right. A sound that rattled Max's senses. His body tensed as he took a step forward, his eyes scanning the field around them. The woman's breath hitched, her grip tightening on him. "What is that?" she whispered, the uncertainty in her voice matching the unease in Max's heart. Max's instincts were on high alert now. There was something, someone, out there, watching. He could feel the presence, like a shadow lurking just beyond the light. The air was thick with anticipation, as if nature itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Max moved slowly, his paws silent on the wet earth. He didn't know what was out there yet, but he knew that this time, it was different. The growls were closer now, and the ducks had fled into the safety of the barn, their frantic quacking rising into the night. The wind whipped around them, and the last embers of the dying sun disappeared, leaving the world in darkness. The moon was covered by thick clouds, and the stars, which had always been his silent companions, were hidden. Then, in an instant, it happened. A shadow, a massive, hulking figure, rushed toward them. Max's heart leapt into his throat, but he didn't hesitate. His body reacted instinctively, muscles coiling, ready for whatever this new threat was. The woman's gasp was cut off as Max darted in front of her, his protective instincts fully awakened. The creature was unlike anything he had ever seen. Large, wild, with eyes that glowed with an unnatural hunger. It was a predator, but one twisted by some darker force. Max's body went rigid, but his heart was strong. He faced the creature without flinching. In his eyes was the same resolve that had carried him through every storm, every fear, every hardship. The growls from the creature were fierce, but they couldn't shake Max. He barked loudly, his voice resonating through the field, a challenge to the shadow before him. The woman, still behind Max, grabbed a nearby shovel, her hands shaking, but she stood tall. Her presence was a steadying force for Max. She wasn't afraid anymore. Together, they had built this life, and she knew she couldn't let anything take it from them now. The creature paused, its eyes narrowing as if sensing that this wasn't going to be an easy fight. Max took another step forward, his body low to the ground, every fiber of his being focused on the threat ahead. He was no longer the scared puppy who had been abandoned in the storm. He was a protector, a guardian. He had a home to defend, a family to protect, and he wasn't about to lose them. The creature took a step back, seemingly calculating its next move. Max stood firm, unwavering. The woman raised the shovel higher, her breath steady now. The moon broke through the clouds, casting a pale light over them. And in that brief moment, everything was still. The storm, the creature, the world, all paused in a breathless standoff. Then, without warning, the creature turned and retreated into the shadows, vanishing back into the dark where it had come from. Max stood, watching it go, his body still tense, but the danger had passed. The woman stepped forward, her hand resting gently on Max's head. "Good boy," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. She looked down at Max, and in his eyes, she saw something more than just a protector. She saw a friend, a companion, and a guardian who had been with her through every storm, every challenge, and who had made this farm their home. Max's tail wagged slowly, and he nuzzled her hand. The danger had passed, but Max knew that this moment was a turning point. The storm had come, and they had faced it together. And no matter what came next, Max knew that they would always rebuild. Together. The woman looked up at the sky, the stars beginning to shine once more. She smiled softly, a quiet, knowing smile. "We're going to be all right, Max." Max gave one final look to the darkened horizon, his heart steady in his chest. He wasn't afraid anymore. He had found his place in the world, and as long as he had the woman by his side, he knew that no storm would ever break them again. And as they turned to walk back to the barn, the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, filling the sky with a soft, golden glow, a promise that, no matter what came their way, they were ready to face it together.